we go. Because Justin's kindly allowed us to do that. And first of all, I just wanted to, in case, anyone missed the news, wanted to let you know that the 2026 URMA annual conference is going to be hosted by the University of Utah. Very excited. And that's going to be held in the middle of June. I think I may have put I'm just so excited about it. I wanted to be together even longer. So I put like an extra day when I made the announcement, June 15th to 19th. It's actually the 16th to 19th. It'll be our usual 3 or 4 day option in the middle of June. And I just saw on LinkedIn someone sharing a video of like beautiful golden light over the University of Utah campus, and it really got me excited to go there. So really looking forward to that. And if you have any questions about that, you can let the board know, or Amanda Ashley, University of Utah, who's our host this year. And the second quick announcement is that we are at the conference going to be awarding for the 3rd year the URMA Distinguished Service Award. And this is an award that our membership, you can nominate another URMA member for to recognize their, above and beyond service to the organization. I see our inaugural winner here on screen, Rachel Coker. So kudos to you. And there's a nomination form in the members only section of the URMA website, and that nomination form will stay open through February 1st. So please put on your thinking caps about someone you'd like to honor with that recognition next year. And that's all for me. Beth, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, there's a question in the chat. When does the registration, conference registration typically open? I don't know the answer.
It typically opens in the new year. So we are just working with the University of Utah partners on getting hotel registration information and everything like that together. And likely, I think we're aiming for early in 2026. But other members of the board can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But we will make an announcement once it's available to the listserv.
All right. Well, thank you. I am Beth Potier from the University of New Hampshire, and I'm also the Vice President of URMA. And I have the pleasure of introducing today's guest. I know I've been eagerly awaiting this. Justin Shaw is with us today. Yay, Justin, it's, I think, 7 p.m. his time in the UK. So thanks for staying up. Justin is going to be telling us about insights from his review of global practices in research communications. Some of us who were at the UPenn conference a few years ago got a sneak peek of this, and he's going to be updating it now. A little bit about Justin. He, for the last 30 years, has worked at Communications Management, which is his own company, as an advisor to universities on issues of communication, reputation, engagement, and influence. Sound like what we all do, or try to. Prior to that, he worked at the University of Hertfordshire in Central Communications, and he was a former journalist. And I will hand it over to Justin. He's got some slides he's gonna show us, and we'll take questions at the end, but if you want to put anything in the chat so you don't forget it, I'll make sure to review those as well. So Justin, you're on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth, and good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. But I recognise some of the faces and names from the previous URMA conferences that I've been to for the last 3 years. So nice to see you again, and also new people. Good to meet you as well. So as Beth says, I'm just going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you should be able to see the slide deck appear there. Yeah, that's up. All good. Excellent. Thank you. So yeah, so some of you may remember I spoke at UPenn. That was in 2023. And I talked about some initial findings from the research that I started to undertake examining practices in research communications globally and what stood out to me. So this builds on that work, and I'm just going to explain a bit about where I've got to as well in terms of that as well. But before I do that, I discovered last night in talking to my son, because I was telling my son that I was speaking at an URMA webinar, and he said, "URMA, they're a band. You're speaking to the band. Apparently there's a band in Transylvania, Romania, called URMA, and he's a big fan of theirs. So I suggest we invite them to Utah for the next conference. Maybe they can do a gig for us. One of their songs is called Shine On, which I think could be a good anthem for URMA. So anyway, something interesting. Look them up on Spotify and Apple iTunes. So my work. So I started out on this pathway many years ago. So as Beth mentioned, I used to work in-house in a university. Part of my job was to lead on research communications. And then for the last 30 years, I've been working with different universities globally to look at different aspects, including addressing research and how research is accessed and engaged. And a few years ago, people were saying to me, actually, what they really needed help to do was to understand more about, well, what does good practice look like? Who's doing outstanding work in this area? And what does beyond the norm look like? So it also prompted some certain triggers. So there's been a growth in interest about the value of research communications and how that makes a difference to universities and institutions as a whole, and the part of reputational uplift that provides. I do a lot of reputational research externally, and one of the feedback pieces I get is not enough is known about those working with a university, for example, employers. Not enough is known about the depth and range of research that is going on. So there's a hunger to know more and find out more about that. There's also been a switch to universities tending to focus on more research priorities, sometimes following the money, sometimes following where the mass of expertise within the institution is, rather than trying to cover every aspect of research. There's rankings going on, and obviously at international level, those are driven by nominations of academics. So the more that your research expertise is known globally amongst world-leading academics, that gives you an edge in rankings nominations as well. So there's all sorts of things at play which have driven this work that I've been doing. And what I've done is been basically talking to people such as yourself who lead on research communications in different institutions around the world, universities, colleges, specialist research institutes, and others who are relevant to that. And I've been exploring aspects such as roles, resourcing, approaches, channels that are used, campaigns, all sorts of things. And by now, I had hoped to have a definitive report written and presented to you, but actually it's got a bit out of control because more questions are coming in than answers, and people are asking me to do more things. So it's rather taken a meandering type direction, and people have added to the list of things that they want solving. Things like, well, what's the implications of AI for our work? How do we get to grips with that? How do we predict the way that AI is going to affect what we do and the tools we use and the veracity of our work as well? But a lot of interest in measurement. So how should we really be measuring the value of our work as research communicators beyond just getting connections through the channels that we're making? There's an interest in how we use our own channels now, because in an era where media distrust is increasingly growing, especially in the States, there's a need to have more credible channels that we have ability to control and manage, working harder for us. And then people are something that's come up more recently is people are interested with how do we connect our research with a younger demographic? And that plays into things like student attraction and student recruitment for institutions as well. So there's a lot being added in all the time. I think when we come to the end, when we come to some questions, I'd just be interested to know from you if there's anything else you think that I should be exploring as part of this. And my aim is to get to Utah with a definitive set of answers for you. So where we are today is that I have some headlines of interesting things that I think personally standing out to me. I think my work inevitably takes me into rabbit holes, things that I'm interested in or pursuing that might be weird or wonderful. So, you know, things like interesting types of research that have been done and stood out. So I'm an avid reader of research papers, and there are all sorts of bizarre research pieces coming out. One in the middle particularly has got my attention recently about whether woodpeckers get headaches or not. Apparently they don't. That's from University of California, Davis. And then on the sort of communication side, if you, I'll send this link round later, but if you have a chance to look at this video that's been produced by the University of Greenland, it's quite interesting. They've done this piece about research fatigue, because in Greenland, there's only a population of 57,000 and they're oversaturated with research. So lots of people are interested in Greenland as a place, but the people who live there are constantly being surveyed and approached for interviews and research focus groups and so on. And this piece is about how they're becoming research fatigue. So quite an interesting piece to look at there. Maybe we'll play that at movie night in Utah. Pieces about being developing anti-research personality. So a couple of people have been writing about this recently, that actually they're tired of their research and needing to connect more easily. So lots of weird stuff going on, as well as the wonderful. So the academic with the most prestigious level of publications. So you may know this person, American academic, who published nearly 4,000 papers. So this is an American academic in the Guinness Book of Records, holds the world record for the most published research about his pet subject area. And his prize for that was getting a dormitory named after him at the University of Colorado. So was it worth it? World's biggest research project going on at the moment. So it's a huge scheme. This is looking at the future of energy and is taking place between 33 nations working on a multi-million-pound development of building the world's largest fusion device, currently in France. And the project started in 2007, but research hasn't really started and won't really start till 2034. So again, interesting scale of stuff happening. And then one of the most amazing things I've come across is this is an example of the biggest engagement project when it comes to research. So every year in Austria, they run this thing called the Long Night of Research. And every institution, research institute, university, anybody conducting research opens up their research to the general public. They have 170,000 participants coming in to visit them in the different places that are running activities across this one night across Austria. So it's the largest example I've come across as a research outreach piece for engagement. Anyway, some wonderful stuff going on as well as some weird stuff. But what we're really here to talk about is the standout stuff, the stuff that I've picked up from my observations of working globally, about interesting things that I would point out to the URMA community that have stood out to me. So the first thing I've been looking at is around structures and how we talk about what good research looks like and what principles for good research communications are. Best example I've come across is this piece from the collective universities operating in Denmark, which identifies 7 principles for good research communications practice. And they go into different areas to identify what great research communications looks like, including focus on tackling uncertainty and the role of research in addressing that. Again, I'll send all these links around so you can have a look separately after this session. And then there are interesting examples that I've come across where different institutions are talking about what is good look like in terms of how we prepare academics and researchers to present their research. So some examples here from the University of Manchester, Wayne State University College of Liberal Arts in Detroit, Saskatchewan in Canada, and Auckland in New Zealand. So tendency to lots of institutions are doing this, presenting roadmaps or pathways that sets out good principles for how you should communicate your research. And these for me are amongst the 4 that have really stood out so far in my analysis. Then I've been exploring how universities have been deciding which areas of research that they tend to profile the most. And most institutions have gone through a process of identifying grand challenges, cross-cutting themes, research banners, all sorts of pots of research that they've chosen to take on and focus on more than others in an area where it's difficult trying to promote every area of research that goes on. So this is quite interesting from the University of Virginia, is that they have had a process where actually they've said, research, all research is at different stages. So not all research is equal in terms of where they're at the moment. So they define it as areas that are promising, that are emergent, that are prominent, or that are preeminent, being the higher level, really. So I think that's quite an interesting example in that approach as well. I've been looking at structures, all sorts of structures and resources of teams. And the one that I'm struck by the most, which I think has just about got almost the perfect model for me, is this one at Coventry University in the UK. And what they've done is to create almost a joint enterprise model, which is a joint model that's owned by both the research office and by central corporate communications as well. So it's a blended approach. Tend to find in most institutions that research communications either sits in the research office or it sits within central communications or marketing or brand or so on. But this model is fairly unique in that it splices both of those. And it has dedicated roles that are designed to pursue both certain areas of research, certain centres or institutes, but also, if you see at the bottom there of this, this organisational chart, each of those officer roles also has a responsibility for either channels or certain aspects of research, such as research degrees or researcher training and development. So it's quite a neat approach. And this is one that, and they've blended budgets, which is quite interesting because that gives it longevity. So the money's filtering in from research funding, not just from central communications funding as well. And then there's another interesting example that I've come across also from the UK, which is the University of Southampton. So they have created this post called Head of Academic Advocacy. And what this is an academic who works in the area of healthcare. He's a researcher. And for 1 day a week, he sits within the Central Communications and Advocacy Department of the university. And his job is to make sure that the Central Communications team is wired into the academic thinking and practices, and that they're attuning what they do in their work to an academic audience and getting greater buy-in within the academic community. So Michael Head, who is this head of academic advocacy, has this joint role, which to me is quite an interesting model. And I'd be interested to know if others have come across similar approaches as well. In terms of other sort of things that have stood out to me, so University of Arizona, this is, for me, is got a neat way of explaining what its research strengths are and also how it presents its statistics and standout performance data as well. So it's got a simple 1-page handout that I often talk about as a model for demonstrating the research credibility and credentials of the University of Arizona. So that for me has stood out as a model that's different there. Then there are examples of universities that are trying to showcase their research in terms of what their activity is and the spread of activity globally. So the University of Cambridge, which is about 10 miles away from where I am at the moment. So they've got this heavily interactive global map that if you look at their website, you can go on this site and you can hover your cursor over different parts of the world, and it will take you into research projects that they're delivering in those geographical regions. So it will take you into detailed case studies and examples and experts that they've got who are working in those areas. And that for me is another example that stands out in terms of how you underline your global credentials and your relevance and impact in different parts of the world as well. And the University of Johannesburg has taken this one step further, and what they've done is to focus purely on societal impact, i.e. the impact that the university makes, particularly on society at the high level. So it's got a real strong tier, which is focusing on the human impact of its work. And if you look at their website and look at the case studies, the work that they've got going on there, they're heavily focused on what does our research actually mean in terms of the real world and bringing change to mankind. There are endless examples of universities producing publications, whether they're online or hard copy, in terms of regular updates on news, detailed, in-depth, long-form pieces as well. And this one has stood out for me because it's from the University of Malta, and what they've done is to include their undergraduate and postgraduate students who are undertaking research projects. And they've actually included a whole section within both the variety of platforms that they have that showcases research coming out of those students as well. So that takes it away from just the formal professional researchers into students as well. And then in Finland, the University of Oulu also has developed a showcase for its PhD students. So often PhD students work through their research and then they present their final thesis, usually to an academic panel and committee, and then they go on to get their PhD. But what happens here is that actually there's a formal part of the discussion, which is the PhD student has to rehearse their argument in a public forum for their research. So they have these doctoral thesis defenses sessions where PhD students present their research, and then they have a counter argument, someone who's an expert in the same subject matter, who's often from a different university, come back and challenging the themes in that research as well. And that's opened up to the public. So it's a way of helping PhD students to make sure they're really nailing down the challenges that are coming into the work that they've done for their research and their analysis, as well as having a chance to, often for the first time, to publicly present their research as well. Quite a lot of interesting work going on in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East at the moment in terms of research. So this is where the money is. You know, we're struggling in the UK, we're struggling in the US because of restrictions, largely driven politically, about research funding. But in the Middle East, there's lots of private funding coming in, which is helping to bolster up and expand their research. And they're definitely a market to watch in terms of what they're up to there. So this struck me as a great example, which is from HAUST, which is the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. It was set up in 2009. And it was the first university in Saudi to actually have a mixed cohort of genders, male and female, across the Middle East. And what they've done is set up these science cafes, which they run every month, and they use those as a forum to bring people in. But they're quite dynamic in terms of the way that they encourage debate and open debate, which is quite refreshing in the way that the Middle East and its heritage has been gone. So they're really making a forefront there, investing a lot in terms of the channels that they're using, and using video through YouTube and other means to strengthen that as well. Then I've been looking at methods of measuring research. So one of the things I've been looking at is different approaches, and Southern Utah University that I came across last year, I've been using a platform called Expert File to profile their academic experts and their researchers, and then to measure the interact that they're having with people are visiting those profiles online, and what's happening in terms of content seeding and placement through that platform as well. So they're actually measuring their interaction that's coming through to those academic experts as well, and using that as one measure there. The other thing I've been looking at in terms of measurement is looking at impact in terms of changing perceptions. So quite often what we do in our research communications work is measure the interactions through, who visits, who reads our articles or visits our blog sites or our social media posts, or who's interacting and following those, rather than what happens as a result. So I've developed a process now where I'm interviewing for different universities. I'm interviewing the people who have a stakeholder relevance to those about. So actually, do they see those pieces of research, and what happens as a result in terms of their changing perceptions and what they know and don't know about the institute, and how do they feel about the institution as a result, and whether they're acting upon what's coming out as well. So a bit about measurement there. And then sort of what I really wanted to focus on in this session was something I've observed from a collective approach. So while we're doing our own work, promoting individual pieces of research that are coming out on a daily basis and they're evolving through academic papers or projects that we're aware of, actually what tends to capture more imagination is the collective approach by bringing different areas of research together, or different expertise together, to present the institution in a sort of more powerful way. So what I've noted here is that there are 4 approaches that seem to be working well, and there are now being more and more adopted by different universities, colleges, and institutions generally. So I just want to talk through some examples of those. But in terms of the headlines, so there are all sorts of campaigns which are aimed at inspiring people at the work that researchers do and the value that they bring, and they make a difference to society, which is really important in terms of the political pressures at the moment. And I know there's some campaigns going on in America about research powering progress from Harvard and UCLA and so on. So I'll talk about a couple of examples of that. Lots of examples around how we're promoting academic experts as change makers in themselves, and what they bring in value in terms of their own inspiration as individuals. And then examples of how we're stimulating and creating mechanisms for people to interact with our research and our research activity. So I'll come on to that. And then finally, at the very highest level, something I've observed is around how there's now examples where universities and colleges have a certain mission that they're promoting about themselves, and what they're showcasing is research that backs up that brand positioning. So they're really focusing on things that are underlining their distinctive mission as well. So some examples just to talk you through around that. So for some of these I've talked through previously, you may remember from the conference at UPenn, but I still think they're very valid and they're evolving all the time. So the best example in terms of inspiration is this work by Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And what they did was they came up with this campaign, which they call it the Change It campaign. What they did is they went across their university, talked to all their researchers to identify how their research was impacting on the problems that are faced by a new and emerging generation, so particularly those being born now or who are in their early years, and the crisis and challenges that they're facing through the immense problems that are going on in the world, and how those are going to impact on their lives as they progress through life. So they collectively brought these stories together, and these tales of that interesting research. And they've tied it into this Change It campaign, which they've been used to inspire people. And they launched it through a documentary which showcased their academics talking about all these problems in relation to the generational challenges that they face, really. And there's some metrics that I've uncovered about the credibility and the impact of that campaign and the inspiration it's driven in terms of sentiment and support for that university. There are other examples. I've been involved with a campaign at the University of Sussex in the UK, which is using the phrase "impossible until it's done," which is a catchphrase that was used, actually coined by Mandela, and it was inspiring about actually until you put your back into your work, you don't know what can be actually achieved. And this has been a rallying cry internally and externally used by the University of Sussex. So they've got lots of examples that they've been using to inspire people in this way about actually you can make change, and it's hard work to break through those barriers. And they're showcasing examples where their researchers actually broke through what they first thought was impossible, restrictions on their work, and how they overcome that as well. So it's about the journeys that academics have gone through there. And this one is through a campaign that's being run live by Loughborough University in the UK at the moment, which they call The World Can't Wait. And basically, what they've identified there is similar to the Monash campaign, the way it's inspiring a rallying call that the world can't wait, and neither should you. And so their vice chancellor, their president, has been talking around how to make sure that the opportunities we create through universities research are actually inspiring people to get involved in that research and even to take up research themselves. And he's written numerous articles championing this theme as well. So lots of work on inspiring change through research. And then there are examples of where we've been profiling academics as heroes, superheroes. So the best example at the University of Birmingham several years ago came up with the Heroes campaign, where they've been profiling certain individual academics who've made a difference. And they've run several campaigns where they've been profiling them, including poster campaigns a lot across traffic points in key stations. And they even ran commissioned posters outside the offices of research funders, major research funding buildings as well. This one's quite interesting, from Memorial University in Canada. So they came up with a comic strip approach. So they've been identifying researchers in terms of the superhero status through actually a parallel Marvel style comic book, and they call it the League of Extraordinary Researchers. So they've been taking very complex research areas and actually simplifying those and telling their stories through very simple comic strip approaches. And there are others who started to come at. So University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg has also been adopting that approach through their curiosity channels as well. This is one that Beth sent me, actually, so Beth might want to jump in at this stage. So I've also been looking at examples of where students doing their own research have been profiled, as well as almost like developing their superpowers through this work. So Beth, anything you want to add to touch on this one?
You know, I can just jump in to say that University of New Hampshire is incredibly tuition dependent, and we rely on a lot of undergraduates. And so this was an attempt, and it's an effort from the top to really connect the power of being a research university to potential undergraduates and undergraduates themselves, and to really say this is what differentiates us in this very, very crowded Northeastern market. So that's what this story was attempting to do, and it's an ongoing issue. We continue to promote this kind of work.
Yeah, I think often it gets neglected that students are doing research as part of their undergraduate programs in particular. I mean, they're contributing greatly as well, and they tend to get ignored as part of the story. So this is a good example of countering that. Few examples of where universities have come up with quite clever approaches to get people involved in the research and experiencing the research themselves. Some examples of voting mechanics. So I talked about these before at different institutions and different conferences. So good examples from the Open University and from University College London, where they've had a voting system to come up and saying, well, here's a range of research that our institutions are providing and tackling. Which do you think, as a member of the public, are most valuable to you and that you would want to see more of us investing more time and effort in? And in the case of the OU, that prompted a big campaign that was led at the bottom there by former model Lily Cole, who was championing this sort of public engagement and voting mechanism. So it was about taking academic research out into the public at large and getting them to interact by voting and discussing on social media about which value areas of research that they most value and why that's important to them as well. And then the same for the Made at UCL campaign, where they actually listed the top 100 discoveries that their research had made over time, and they got people voting on which of those discoveries that they felt delivered most value, and they had 20,000 voters on that campaign, and 2 million social media interactions discussing and raising debate about these different areas as well. So they were using the public voting system to try and stimulate interest and getting discussion going, and that's something that's taking off at the moment as well. And then there are other approaches. So in Canada, the University of Guelph has an annual competition where it asks their researchers themselves to take images of them out in their field of work, demonstrating their field. So they ask them to come up with an image that best shows and reflects the nature of their research that they're doing. So this through the lens campaign. And then they have a big exhibition every year that demonstrates these images, and they use that again as part of their public engagement. So it's a photo exhibition, a moment in time to announce the winners of this, as well as externally involve people coming in and through using these images as a way of interacting and getting people to be part of a sort of showcase visually of that research as well. And I didn't want to pass up the opportunity that came up when we were at the URMA conference this year, that Mike Terrazas at the University of Georgia was talking about an internal campaign that he'd been running, and it was asking researchers at his university to have tattoos done or designed to summarize their research work as well. So he went out and asked people to come up with the best research that shows and represents the work that they're doing through their research. And they had 64 entrants internally for that campaign. And I think we had 3 winners in the end, and the winners were announced on what is the National Tattoo Day, which I think is a US thing, taking place in July. So they timed it cleverly around that. So all sorts of quirky, interesting ways of getting interaction around research and showcasing research as well. It's standing out to me. And then finally, so these are examples of where I think universities are picking research focus areas that best represent what they stand for as a university. So I don't think Joe Case is here on this session, but if he were here, he'd probably chip in around this piece, because he and I have talked a lot about how the University of Florida has been positioning themselves as the university for artificial intelligence. And that is based on quite substantial funding that the university's had, $100 million from NVIDIA, which works in this area, which is founded by an alumnus of theirs and has been funding research into AI over years. And so they have been focusing on their mission as an AI intensive university, and then showing how research that they're doing is supporting that agenda and really fixating and focusing on that as a standout area of research as well. So it's an example of how an institution is particularly making a thematic approach centrally and cohesively to its research as well. And there's other examples. So a few years ago, a new higher education institution called the London Interdisciplinary School was set up. And the basis of this institution was that students would come and study not just in a subject area, but combine different interdisciplinary areas. And the core nature of the student experiences was that they would undertake their own research project. And so one of the students, Anna Howard, undertook a project that demonstrates how AI has been showing bias in the way it portrays people's profiles and bias in society types. And we're using Barbie dolls as an example of how that's come about. So she did research demonstrating how different Barbie dolls were stereotyping people too much. And they've used that project to demonstrate as a research focus about how it's an interdisciplinary piece that brings threads together about what they stand for as an institution. Other examples are University of Derby in the UK. They've been using the turtle as their standpoint, as their standout image. And this is because they have an academic expert who works on coral reefs. So Derby in the UK is probably the most landlocked place, furthest from oceans and seas that you could get. But yet they have this academic called Michael Sweet, who's an ecologist, and he's been working in Australia looking at how coral reefs are being degraded by pollution, and how the impacts has on turtles, and how turtles are barometers of the quality of coral reefs. And so they've been using the turtle as a university icon, really, through his work to represent there's a better future. So they've really focused on this one area of research as summarizing what they stand for in terms of human improvement and tackling a key global issue as well, and making that imagery important and relevant as a standpoint for their own university. And then this is an example I've talked about before, but I think for me, it is the best global example I've come across. So this is from the University of Reading. You may know this story. So University of Reading, its main focus is around climate change and how it's combating climate change. So it's had an academic called Ed Hawkins who came up with this iconic image a few years ago, which is basically a bar chart that demonstrates how the planet is heating up over the last 500 years. So you'll see it on your screen there, that it's gone from cool to the red stripes of how in recent years this is hotting up. And the universities use that as an icon to take to different places. So it's now featured at the COP conferences as the backdrop panel. It's featured in the media. It's now featured on merchandise. You know, you've got leggings and ties and cufflinks and everything that people can buy that basically summarizes the danger and the threat that planet's driven. And this has all come from the work from this academic group led by Ed Hawkins. And what they did was they set up a funding site, which basically says, we'd love it if you could support this work. So if you're going to use this image, then at the same time, please, could you make a donation, however small, that will then fund future PhD research into climate change as well. So they have their Show Your Stripes Climate Change spin-off website that is funding that research. So they've really worked hard on pushing this. But cleverly, and more recently, they now have a Show Your Stripes Day every year. And that takes place as a multi-stakeholder festival. It's also tied into an open day for prospective students. They have done a deal with PlayStation. So this year, PlayStation 5 was launched. And what the University of Reading did was to launch a new game, which they got PlayStation commission, and it's called Climate Station. And it's an immersive game that if you go on PlayStation 5, you can map out the future of what the planet is going to look like at different measures of heat damage over the next few years and in the centuries to come. So they've cleverly done this deal with PlayStation, and then they've used that PlayStation game as a way to interact with future generations and with parents and so on, about getting them to understand that the research that they're doing, and showing the horrors that we're facing generally, really. So I think the University of Reading is really clear in this about what they're trying to promote the most, and how they're using this through multi-channels, different clever aspects, and getting commercial partners involved as well. So they're really a standout example for me in this multi-mission based approach as well. One area that I'm looking at quite closely more and more now, and people have asked me to do this, is to look at the new generations coming in, who are now interested in engaged in research. So you may know this book by Jonathan Haidt that I've read. It's almost like a Bible for understanding my kids. So it's about Generation Z, and how they think and feel. And he's done a section in there which is looking at students, and saying that if we want to win over the current generation of young students coming into universities now, we really need to work harder at getting them into what he calls discover mode rather than defend mode, which is having a reason not to get involved with things. So we have an anxious, nervous generation, which is certainly summarizing my kids, who are really worried about this stuff, but they're not getting their heads around what's going on to tackle and relieve the pain and the challenges that we're facing. So there's a need to look at that and how we present research to future generations. And there's some good work being done by different agencies to do this at the moment. So in Australia, there's a company called McCrindle, which is a demographics agency. Then they look at the channels that are being used by different demographic generations. And they're looking at Gen Z now, they're looking at Gen A, and they're looking at Gen B, which is the next emerging generation, of course, and the types of channels that they use and the behaviors that they have and how they prefer to be communicated with as well. So I'm looking at that. And something that I've started to experiment with some universities is a new interactive approach. So if we think about what's going on in terms of prime time television and what attracts generations at the moment, so this still is taken from the UK-based series called The Traitors, which I know in the US then you stole, and you now have the US version of Traitors as well. But this is a sort of example of how there's a fixation to want to look at how people behave in a captured situation, and gamify. So that's coming through now as an example of how we get newer generations involved in research. I've got some institutions now who are experimenting with different activities like this, that they get students involved in, and they get young people involved in, to really discuss research, get around the table, and have a sort of gamified approach to this as well. So that's something that seems to be taking off, and I'd be interested in anybody's examples of work that they've got going on in that area as well. And then the other thing, finally, that I'm working on at the moment is a model which is connecting the importance of research to reputation. So why is what we do for research communications so important to the credibility and the credentials of universities, and linking that into, first of all, it expands and builds knowledge, which leads into trust about who we are as an institution and the work that we make, that then leads into an action, an involvement, an impact, and an outcome. So I'm looking at how we can create a model which easily explains to those who fund and lead on institutions and research about the real value and difference that we're making. In other words, the story that we tell about the journey of research and how that makes an overall difference to what we're trying to achieve and make an impact on. And then by next June, hopefully, I will have had to you even more examples and have condensed this down so it's in a palatable paper-based research format. So it will collect all these examples together and explain the sort of logic trail about why these things stand out and what can we learn from these different examples and approaches. So really looking forward to that in June next year, and seeing you there and hoping to share those examples at that time. So there we go, a bit of a race through. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and move on to any questions. And Beth, Katie, I don't know whether you want to facilitate questions or comments that have been coming through.
I haven't seen any questions come through the chat, but so we'll open it up to the floor. Does anybody have a question for Justin? You have a lot of applause.
That's good.
Just go
You
ahead
never
and
hear that from these type of sessions. You never hear the applause, so it's an echo chamber, isn't it? You're only hearing yourself, so it's good to have that.
Anyone's got a question? Go ahead and unmute. I can start with one. I am especially curious about that last point that you shared about that sort of virtuous cycle of research to reputation to action. What are you finding on that? Do you have any insights to give us now?
Well, I think the way it's being used, and I'm testing at the moment, is how to get those at to start with, those at the very top of institutions to buy into the idea that ultimately what we're trying to make a change on is the reputation of the institute that's funding our work, and is behind that. So they really get that. They get the importance of research, but not necessarily the importance and the roles of research communications teams and professionals that we're doing. So it's a way of making that connections and housing. So I'm starting to use that to help teams have conversations with that senior level, really. So that's where that is at the moment with that model.
All right, thank you. Anybody else have a question for Justin about what he's learned? You have a very global perspective. I think the vast majority of us are US based. So it's interesting seeing what other universities are doing outside of the US.
I had just a quick question, Justin. You talked a little bit about certain universities that are framing their missions around like research into action, or research for the service of these grand challenges. And to me, it sort of strikes me as a little bit of a frame shift, like from universities as just the sources of knowledge production to universities as places where that action actually happens, or the translation actually happens into action. And I'm just curious what your impressions of that are, and if this is like, if we're seeing kind of to some extent a shift in universities like missions, like, are we really thinking about stepping down from the ivory tower and like trying to get in and work on the ground a little bit more, at least project that kind of image?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say is the connection between the research of a university and the education experience of the students. And in most universities, they still tend to be entirely separate operations. And what this is doing, this approach of creating more unified approaches, is to trying to unify the whole activity of a university or an institution together, so that it's creating more energy that brings the community of the university together as one, working together, rather than seeing them as sort of separate streams of income and activity. And I think that's not new. That started to happen in the last, I think, particularly since COVID, that started to happen more and more. But also at a time when we've got certainly in many institutions a sort of downturn in interest from young people applying to university and considering other options instead of going to university, and a political sort of dynamic that there's actually talking against universities, more so in the States than in the UK, I know, but having to counter that with the different people to work harder, to tell that story in a more compelling, easier, simple way, in a more passionate and emotional way as well than used to be the case.
Right, thank you.
I have to unmute. There's a question in the chat. I'm intrigued by the institutions that have narrowed their focus on a particular niche. How do the other research areas in those places respond?
So the short answer is that I've got no evidence about the sort of the downplayed researchers that may feel disaffected. I mean, where I've done some work in this way, I think the feeling is that we have to stand out as an institution, and in order to do that, we have to stop talking about the same things that all other universities are saying, that they're great at, 5 or 6 different areas of research expertise. Actually, the longest list I've seen is 22 areas of research from one university. So I know it's impossible to get your head around those. But if you had one flagship area that cements into the core mission of a university, that's really going to make you stand out against the competition. So it is about competitiveness, I think, and how you really make that mark rather than being lost in the crowd of what other institutions are saying, really. It's quite a bold approach that's being taken.
We have a few more questions. Let's see if we can get through them. One is wondering, have you come across many commercial entities that are focused on science communication, so outside of academia?
Not really. I mean, that's not my area of expertise and my focus. It's been higher education as a market by and large, or associated research institutions that are publicly funded rather than the commercial sector. So I haven't seen those examples.
Okay, and the last question I have, do you have any information on how universities have successfully connected with people outside of the science-curious public, or even better, on how they have persuaded people to a different perspective using research storytelling?
I think that goes back to the engagement mechanism, really. That's sort of getting people hands-on involved. So that, when I was talking really in the beginning about Austria and that giant night of research that they have as a mechanic to try and incentivize and get people really involved in research. I think that is the storytelling approach that's been going on. So a bigger, higher level, more multi-level collective approach to get people engaged. So it's not just about the storytelling, it's also about the interactivity that you create through that as well. And I use the example of the traitors analogy there as a method to get particularly young people involved in that as well. So it's not just storytelling, it's story immersing as well.
The last question, and you may need to take it to the listserv. Let's see. Of the examples you've shared today, can you speak to how well resourced those research communications teams are in terms of level of staffing? A few years ago, it looked like UK universities were really growing their research comm staff. Is that still the case now?
So I started out on this piece of analysis 2.5 years ago. And the problem I've had is that the stuff I uncovered in the beginning is now changing dramatically. So I know, for example, in the UK, there are universities that created research communications teams in their own right 3 years ago, and now they've gone because the funding isn't there. Teams have slimmed down. I know examples in the US that's happened as well. So funding is driving everything, and if the money isn't there, we're having to change that as well. There's more investment going in to crisis communications than there is into research communications in a lot of institutions that I've come across, which tells a lot about the situation that we're in at the moment.
Well, Justin, we are a little beyond our time limit, which probably speaks to the engagement with this topic. Thank you so much for staying up late or staying at work late and sharing your work with us. And I think I can speak for everyone to say that we're really looking forward to hearing what you present in Utah. And thanks to everybody for joining us. And I believe we will be making this recording available. Is that right, Katie? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.
Good to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Take care.